I never imagined that my life would become the subject of a viral tragedy, a cautionary tale about pride and prejudice. But that's exactly what happened the moment I saw the letter from the state university. It sat on the chipped Formica counter, heavy with the future it promised, and I had exactly $2,000 to cover a tuition bill of $42,000, a terrifying math problem that only seemed to multiply my anxiety, an emotion that tightened my chest, making the air in the small apartment feel thick and hard to breathe. The letter wasn't addressed to me, but to my daughter, Maya, who was upstairs right then, practicing her violin, the sweet, mournful sound of box chaconne filtering down as a stark counterpoint to the ugly reality of my bank account. A reality that hit me like a physical blow when I looked at my calloused hands. Hands that had built houses for 20 years but couldn't seem to build a future for my own kid. The conflict began not with a shout, but with a piece of expensive, cream-colored stationery that arrived alongside Maya's acceptance. A separate invitation for a family future planning session hosted by my ex-wife, Sarah, and her new husband, Richard. An invitation that smelled faintly of success and superiority, and I knew, instinctively, that this was the start of the final, defining conflict of Maya's childhood. Richard, the man who drove an imported sports car and wore custom-made suits, the man who saw my humble existence as an amusing failure, was about to insert himself into the one thing I couldn't fail, giving Maya her shot at life, and I knew deep down that whatever he offered would come with a humiliating price tag. A price I wasn't sure I could afford, not financially, but spiritually, as the memory of his smirk from the last parent-teacher night flashed in my mind. A smirk that said, "You're a relic, a placeholder." But I didn't know that the real battle wasn't for the money, but for Maya's respect. My world wasn't glamorous. It was concrete dust, the smell of fresh lumber, and the rhythmic thud of a framing hammer. But it was honest, a stark contrast to the sterile, glass-walled world of Richard Sterling, the man who had effortlessly stepped into the role of successful father figure to Maya, a role I hadn't lost, but had certainly been overshadowed in. Sarah and I had built a life on love, not money, but after the divorce, that foundation crumbled, leaving me with the small apartment above my construction office and a shared custody agreement that felt more like a scheduled visitation with my own heart. The relationship with Maya, however, was solid, forged in late-night talks over cheap pizza and the shared silence of working on school projects. She'd come home from Richard's mansion, smelling faintly of expensive perfume and complaining about the coldness of marble floors, only to relax when she sank into the worn, familiar armchair in our living room. I remember the worn leather of her favorite armchair, its distinctive smell of old books and dust, a scent of comfort. Richard's presence was a subtle poison, a constant reminder of my financial shortcomings, always planting subtle seeds of doubt, such as the time he casually mentioned the high cost of private college counseling. Knowing I could barely afford public school supplies, always using his wealth not as a tool, but as a weapon. He never openly insulted me. It was always subtext, the way he emphasized his recent yacht purchase in front of me, or the way he always picked Maya up in a different, even more luxurious vehicle just to make a statement, a silent, glittering monologue of success that made my old pickup truck look like a broken toy. This slow, steady erosion of my dignity was the real conflict, and the upcoming future planning session was clearly his grand finale, his opportunity to not just offer help, but to perform a public act of salvation, a gesture that would finally solidify his superior position in Maya's eyes, an outcome I dreaded more than bankruptcy itself, and the thought of his patronizing tone made my stomach churn with a sickening mix of anger and helplessness. I could already hear the soft click of his Italian leather shoes against the polished floor, the sound of judgment approaching. The emotional roller coaster of this whole situation was just starting to climb the first hill. The inciting incident didn't happen at the meeting. It arrived 3 days before, neatly packaged in an email from Sarah. The subject line was simply, "Richard's offer." I clicked it, my hands clammy, the humid air of the shop clinging to my skin as I leaned back in my office chair, its worn springs protesting with a familiar, sad squeak. Richard was offering to pay Maya's entire tuition and living expenses for 4 years at the prestigious East Coast University, a figure north of $300,000, which was an astronomical sum that made my construction business earnings look like pocket change, and my mind immediately went to the immense relief that would bring to Maya, who wouldn't have to carry the crushing burden of student loans, a burden I knew intimately. But the offer wasn't a gift. It was a contract, a meticulously drafted, 5-page legal document with one specific clause buried in the fine print. An agreement that required me to formally sign over all future financial decision-making rights concerning Maya's education to Richard, essentially making him her sole financial guardian. A move that legally marginalized my role as her father and gave him total, unquestioned control over her academic and career path. A move he clearly designed to neuter my influence completely. I could taste the metallic, bitter tang of betrayal in the back of my throat, not from Sarah, but from the cold calculation of Richard, who was using his immense wealth to buy my silence and my rights as a parent. A calculated corporate maneuver straight out of his boardroom playbook. The air in the dusty office suddenly felt suffocatingly thin, and the sunlight streaming through the grimy window illuminated the swirling motes of dust, dancing specks that seemed to mock the chaos in my heart. He knew I couldn't afford the tuition, and he was counting on my financial desperation to force me into signing away my parental authority. A move so cynical it made my vision tunnel with white-hot rage, but I still couldn't ignore the promise of a debt-free future for my daughter. I grabbed a warm soda from the small fridge, the aluminum can sticky with condensation, and crushed it in my hand, the sharp snap a meager release for the pressure building inside. What happened next changed everything. But first, I had to find a loophole. My first instinct was denial, a furious, desperate surge of pride that made me want to call Richard immediately and tell him exactly what he could do with his manipulative contract and his blood money. But the rational part of my brain, the part that framed houses and balanced ledger books, took over, reminding me that a knee-jerk rejection would only hurt Maya, who was already dreaming of the ivy-covered halls and the intellectual freedom that came with a world-class education. So, I tried the normal route, the way any responsible father would. I spent 2 grueling days pounding the pavement, calling every contact, every loan officer, every old business partner, trying to scrape together a respectable counteroffer. Some way to match Richard's generosity without signing away my soul, only to be met with the cold, hard clunk of reality every single time. My bank laughed when I mentioned a $300,000 unsecured loan. My business partner offered a sympathetic sigh and a $5,000 line of credit that was more of an insult than a help, and the weight of the rejection felt like I was carrying a stack of drywall up 3 flights of stairs in July, the sweat stinging my eyes, the strain palpable. I could hear the distant, repetitive clank of metal on metal from a nearby construction site, a sound that usually brought me comfort but now just emphasized my failure to build enough capital for my own daughter. I even called a rival contractor, a man I hadn't spoken to in 5 years after a brutal bidding war, and his curt, "Sorry, Frank, market's tight," echoed in my head, a final metallic chime of defeat. The more doors I knocked on, the clearer the picture became. Richard's offer wasn't just generous. It was strategically insurmountable, designed to fail any attempt I made to match it, ensuring his contractual control was the only viable option left standing. My normal, rational attempts at a solution only cemented the fact that this wasn't a financial problem anymore. It was a power play, and I had just walked onto his corporate battlefield completely unarmed. A carpenter trying to fight a Wall Street titan, a realization that burned with a deep, humiliating heat. Nothing could have prepared me for the meeting that Richard insisted on having the next day. The problem escalated from a private, financial headache to an unavoidable public humiliation the moment I walked into Richard's immaculate, high-rise office. The air conditioning so aggressively cold it felt like the room itself was judging the sweat on my brow. Richard, seated behind an enormous, polished mahogany desk, didn't stand up. He simply gestured to the leather chair opposite him, a small, arrogant movement that spoke volumes, and the light reflecting off his expensive watch flashed directly into my eyes. A subtle, disorienting tactical maneuver, I was sure. Maya was there, too, seated quietly next to her mother, Sarah, who looked uncomfortable, her eyes darting between Richard's confident smirk and my clearly strained composure, a physical manifestation of the impossible tension in the room, and her presence made the stakes skyrocket from my personal pride to Maya's respect for me. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of Richard's strong cologne and the hushed formality of corporate power, a smell completely alien to the sawdust and diesel of my world, and I noticed the pristine, unblemished white of his desk, not a single speck of dust, which seemed to emphasize the chaos of my own life. Richard finally spoke, his voice a smooth, low baritone, effortlessly condescending, and instead of just discussing the contract, he launched into a 10-minute monologue about the risks of unmanaged debt and the responsibility of financial stewardship, all delivered while looking directly at Maya, never me, effectively painting me as the irresponsible, poor father who would saddle her with loans, contrasting sharply with his own image as the prudent savior. He used phrases like Frank's situation and a necessary course correction, each word a tiny, invisible dagger aimed directly at my dignity, and the most devastating detail was Maya's expression. A small, almost imperceptible flicker of doubt in her eyes when she looked at me, a silent question about my ability to provide, a look that tore right through me. The problem had become impossible to ignore. His money wasn't the leverage, her love was, and I knew right then that I couldn't just fight for the tuition. I had to fight for her faith in me. A silent, desperate war being waged across the sterile perfection of Richard's desk. But I didn't know that the contract wasn't the real trap. It was the decoy. My first attempt at a solution, a desperate legal maneuver, was to hire the cheapest, hungriest lawyer I could find. An old friend from high school named Vinny who now specialized in small-time contract disputes, operating out of a cramped, dimly lit office above a pizza shop where the smell of oregano perpetually hung in the air. A humble setting far removed from Richard's corporate tower. Vinny, wearing a slightly stained tie and perpetually running late, looked over the meticulously worded 5-page agreement, running his finger along the clause that transferred my rights, and after an hour of frantic consultation punctuated by the ding of the pizza shop's bell, his face was grim. He confirmed that the document was ironclad, a legal fortress specifically designed to withstand any challenge from a father in my financial bracket, and his only suggestion was to negotiate a symbolic, minor amendment, a pointless vanity clause that wouldn't actually affect Richard's ultimate control. I felt a partial failure wash over me, the realization that I couldn't beat him on his own terms, in his own game of legal chess, hitting me hard, like running headfirst into a concrete wall I hadn't seen in the dust. The only small win, the tiny silver lining in this cloud of legal jargon, was a passing comment Vinny made, almost as an afterthought, about a completely unrelated clause detailing a penalty for premature termination of the agreement by either party. A standard clause that involved a substantial financial disbursement to the student Maya, if the payer backed out before the 4 years were up. The clause was a complete non-starter for Richard, of course, as he was highly invested in seeing it through, but it was the first small crack in the fortress wall, a detail so irrelevant that even Richard probably didn't think twice about it. A legal necessity that suddenly glowed with potential in the dim light of Vinny's office. It wasn't the solution, but it was a new weapon, a tiny pebble to throw at the giant, and the thought of forcing Richard's hand, of turning his own contractual perfection against him, injected a much-needed, defiant surge of energy into my despair, giving me a moment of hope before the long struggle ahead. The emotional roller coaster had stalled on a high point, but the drop was coming soon. The unexpected ally appeared not in a courtroom, but in the dusty, quiet storage area of my construction office. An unlikely figure, my foreman, Marco, a man known for his silent efficiency and his uncanny ability to foresee structural weaknesses in any blueprint, a trait I hadn't realized extended to human relationships. Marco, a man whose hands were even more calloused than mine and who always smelled faintly of sawdust and black coffee, walked in while I was staring blankly at Richard's contract, the thin paper trembling slightly in my hand. He didn't ask what was wrong. He simply watched me for a long, heavy silence before finally speaking, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, observing, "You're reading too much on the paper, boss, and not enough on the man." He then revealed a completely unexpected, astonishing piece of information, a secret he had gleaned from his previous job, a lifetime ago, as a maintenance manager at a prestigious downtown high-rise where Richard Sterling had his first major office. Richard, despite his facade of financial invincibility, was notoriously, pathologically obsessed with perception, with the flawless public image of success, and that any major public failure or scandal, even a purely symbolic one, was more terrifying to him than any actual financial loss. He recounted a story about Richard almost firing a janitor for leaving a single watermark on the marble lobby floor right before a major media interview. A small detail that painted a huge picture of a man driven by vanity and the relentless pursuit of a perfect exterior. A man who saw his wealth not just as money, but as armor against public judgment. Marco's revelation was a game changer. It meant that the battle wasn't about the money or the contract's legality, but about public relations, about leverage over Richard's ego, the one thing he couldn't control with his lawyers or his money. The air suddenly felt charged with possibility, replacing the choking feeling of defeat with a sharp, invigorating sense of focus, and I noticed the faint, metallic smell of Marco's tools on his belt, the scent of practical problem-solving. Marco's silent support, the way he stood by the door, his shoulders broad and reassuring, was a far more valuable asset than any lawyer, offering me not legal advice, but a tactical advantage, a way to attack the unseen weak point of my adversary, his crippling need for respect and admiration. But I didn't know that the path to his public undoing would require me to make a sacrifice I wasn't sure I could live with. The stakes increased dramatically when I made the mistake of mentioning the contract to Maya during one of our pizza nights, a moment I immediately regretted as the words left my mouth, noticing the way her smile faltered, her eyes clouding over with a mixture of confusion and disappointment, a look that made my heart ache. I tried to explain the problematic clause, the parental rights transfer, framing it carefully, avoiding any overtly negative language about Richard, but I used the wrong words, sounding to her like a desperate, jealous father trying to undermine a generous offer, and her response was a swift, defensive shield for her stepdad, a subtle but devastating shift in loyalty, a consequence that hit me harder than any financial blow. "Dad," she said, her voice small but firm, picking at the crust of her pizza, the smell of burnt cheese filling the awkward silence. "Richard just wants to help. Why are you making this so complicated? I'm not a child anymore. I know what I'm signing." That sentence, "I know what I'm signing," was a sharp, personal blow, implying that I was the one who didn't trust her judgment, and the consequences of my clumsy revelation were immediate and painful. I saw the subtle widening of the gap between us, the realization that Richard had already succeeded in positioning himself as the mature, reliable option, while I was relegated to the role of the proud, problematic father clinging to control. The emotional stakes weren't just about my dignity anymore. They were about my relevance in her adult life, a threat to our bond that was far more terrifying than the university tuition itself. The silence that followed was heavy and cold, broken only by the distant, lonely wail of a police siren outside, a sound that seemed to echo the internal alarm bells ringing in my mind. I realized that my attempts to protect her from Richard's scheme were inadvertently pushing her closer to him, fulfilling his plan even without the contract being signed, and the thought that I could lose her respect, her trust, was the true point of despair, making the entire battle feel pointless. This new level of personal consequence forced a radical shift in my strategy. I could no longer be just the good, protective father. I had to become the strategically silent one, the one who played a long, complicated game, even if it meant risking her temporary disappointment.
Naquele momento, eu percebi que para vencer, eu tinha que parecer que estava perdendo.
The temporary low point arrived on the day of the signing, which Richard insisted on holding in his high-rise office again, transforming a simple legal procedure into a staged spectacle of his own generosity, a scene designed entirely for my public defeat. I walked into the room, smelling the heavy, damp air from a sudden, unexpected downpour outside, the rain streaking down the panoramic windows like tears, and I saw Maya there, dressed in a new, expensive outfit I knew Richard had bought, her hair perfectly styled, looking every bit the polished, successful college student to be, a vision of what Richard's money could buy. When I sat down, Richard slid the contract across the table, a crisp, intimidating document, and he spoke slowly, deliberately, directing his words not to me, but to the lawyer and Sarah. "Frank, I understand this is a difficult moment for you, relinquishing control, but we must prioritize Maya's future above, shall we say, personal sentimentalities." The lawyer nodded solemnly, Sarah wouldn't meet my eye, and Maya stared at the pen Richard had presented her. An expensive, silver fountain pen, a symbol of the new world she was entering, a world I hadn't built for her, a world Richard was now opening. I felt a crushing sense of inadequacy, a low point so profound it threatened to swallow my resolve entirely, a despair that tasted like ash and defeat in the back of my throat. I was about to sign the most humiliating document of my life, one that officially labeled me as the financial footnote in my daughter's future, and the sheer weight of his condescension, his flawless performance as the benevolent benefactor, made me want to scream, to smash the mahogany desk and rip the contract to shreds. But I knew that any outburst would only solidify his narrative of me being the volatile, irresponsible parent. I swallowed my pride, the bitter, metallic taste almost choking me, and reached for the pen, my hand trembling slightly, the movement a clear, public sign of my surrender. The air was thick with the silent triumph of Richard, a man who had won the entire fight without raising his voice or spending a dime, simply by wielding his immense, crushing financial power. Nothing could be prepared for the small detail I noticed on the corner of the contract. The new information that changed everything was the sight of a small, almost invisible indentation on the contract itself, a faint ghost outline left by a previous signature that had been erased, a detail I only caught because of the way the expensive, glossy paper reflected the afternoon light just so. Richard, meticulous to a fault, had clearly printed this copy after erasing a previous, quickly signed draft, and a sudden, cold jolt of certainty shot through me, replacing the despair with a laser-like focus. Richard was hiding something he was so desperate to cover up that he had rushed the final signing, skipping his usual corporate protocol of drafting a fresh, pristine copy. My mind, trained to spot structural weaknesses in foundation walls, immediately zeroed in on the faint, almost imperceptible scratch marks near the initialing boxes, and I quickly reread the penalty clause that Vinny had mentioned, the one detailing the massive payout to Maya if Richard prematurely terminated the agreement. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, cynical clarity. Richard, the master manipulator, was not worried about me. He was worried about a completely external, unforeseen event that required him to have a quick, clean exit, an event that would necessitate him terminating the agreement, triggering the clause, and proving that he was never truly worried about Maya's education, only about the optics. The immediate realization was a stunning reversal of expectations. I was no longer fighting his control, but his escape, his cynical backup plan. I leaned back in the chair, a slow, strategic smile replacing my look of defeat, catching Richard's eye for the first time, a moment that made the confident smirk on his face falter for just a fraction of a second, a moment of pure, unexpected fear in his eyes. I could feel the electricity of revelation humming in the air around me, and I realized that my only chance was to force him into a position where his desperate need for a clean exit would become his public downfall, a situation where the penalty clause, designed to protect Maya from him, would become the very weapon I used to destroy his pristine reputation. What happened next changed everything. I had a path to redemption, but it was fraught with danger. The critical decision was not to sign the contract immediately, but to stall, a move that flew directly in the face of Richard's carefully orchestrated timeline, a deliberate application of the time pressure that I had felt for the past week, only now directed back at him. I picked up the silver pen, rolling its cool, expensive weight in my fingers, enjoying the small act of defiance, and then, looking directly into Richard's suddenly apprehensive eyes, I said, in a calm, firm voice that surprised even myself, "Richard, this is a major legal agreement. I need 24 hours to have my lawyer perform one final, meticulous review of the penalty termination clause. It's standard procedure for an agreement this large, even one involving a family member." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute, broken only by the slight whoosh of the high-rise air circulation system. Richard's face went from smug confidence to a barely contained fury, the jaw muscles in his cheek visibly twitching with frustrated rage, an admission that my simple request had completely derailed his carefully constructed plan for a quick, clean victory. The consequences of this decision were immediate and irreversible. Richard exploded, not with a shout, but with a cold, hissing intensity, accusing me of cheap dramatics and unnecessary distrust. His controlled facade cracking just enough for me to see the desperate man underneath, a man who desperately needed this contract signed and buried right now. Maya, sensing the sudden escalation of tension, looked utterly confused, glancing from Richard's thinly veiled anger to my surprisingly calm demeanor, the tension in the room so thick I could practically taste the ozone. I knew this was the point of no return. By stalling, I had thrown the gauntlet down, declaring war on Richard's schedule and his ego, and the next 24 hours would be a frantic race against time. A desperate scramble to find the external force that was pushing him, the force that was hiding in the subtle scratch marks on the contract. I stood up, placing the silver pen gently back on the mahogany desk, a conscious move of non-surrender, and walked out, leaving a trail of silent, escalating chaos behind me. the cold, smooth feel of the marble floor under my shoes reminding me of the long, difficult road ahead. Naquili momento, eu percebi que a única forma de proteger minha filha era expor verdade. Neo so sobrio contrato. Mas sobrio hamem que estava por trás dele my plan, now in action, was a high-stakes, 24-hour investigation centered around Richard's public image. A move that felt completely alien to my world of blueprints and concrete, but which I knew, thanks to Marco, was Richard's true weakness. I mobilized my small network. Marco, Vinny, and a few old high school friends who worked in lower level, overlooked jobs downtown, and instructed them to scour the internet, the obscure local business journals, and even the gossip columns, looking not for financial ruin, but for any sign of a major, immediate, and public PR disaster brewing that would require Richard to quickly distance himself from any public-facing financial commitment, such as a major, multi-year university tuition. Sponsorship. For hours, I sat in my dusty office, the metallic scent of old filing cabinets surrounding me, staring at my computer screen, the flickering blue light illuminating the frantic typing, feeling like a detective in a cheap, suspenseful film, searching for the one, single, tiny piece of information that would expose Richard's escape clause and trigger the substantial penalty payout to Maya. The plan seemed to be working. By midday, Vinny called, his voice breathless with excitement, reporting that Richard's name was conspicuously absent from the finalized list of major donors for the annual citywide Future Leaders Scholarship Gala, an event Richard had publicly headlined for the past 5 years, a social snub that was far too deliberate to be accidental. Then, a friend who worked in commercial real estate emailed me a speculative rumor about a massive, disastrous environmental lawsuit surrounding a newly acquired, highly publicized overseas land deal by Richard's holding company, a rumor that was being heavily censored and suppressed by his high-powered PR team, but which was causing palpable panic in the usually placid world of his company's stock. I could almost hear the distant, rhythmic thump of Richard's corporate world starting to buckle under the strain, the realization dawning that my 24-hour delay was not an act of pride, but a strategic siege against his crumbling facade, and the anticipation of his inevitable exposure sent a thrilling, defiant jolt through me, a sense of having finally found the leverage I needed. Ok aconteció a seguir mudo tudo. The success of the plan brought an unexpected, dangerous complication. The unexpected complication arrived in the form of Sarah, my ex-wife, who appeared at my office door unannounced, her face drawn and pale, a woman clearly under immense, crushing pressure, the sharp, almost clinical scent of her expensive office perfume clashing with the earthy smell of sawdust and old coffee in my workshop. She didn't come to argue or defend Richard. She came to plead, and her voice, usually steady and composed, was trembling with barely suppressed fear, a raw, exposed emotion I hadn't seen since our divorce 10 years ago. Frank, you have to sign it. Now, Richard is going to ruin you if you don't. He's already started, she whispered, her eyes wide with a genuine terror that was far more convincing than any corporate threat, and the tension in the small, cluttered room felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. She then dropped the bombshell. Richard, angered by my delay, had subtly leveraged his influence to have the city's zoning department suddenly schedule an unscheduled mandatory compliance inspection on my main construction site the very next morning. An inspection guaranteed to find some minor, obscure violation, enough to issue a crippling, immediate stop work order that would effectively bankrupt my business within a week, a brutal, calculated use of his power to force my hand through. Economic terrorism, a tactic straight out of a mob playbook, not a boardroom. This unexpected escalation changed the game entirely. It was no longer about Maya's contract, but about my entire livelihood, my ability to provide, and the realization that Richard would resort to such vicious, underhanded tactics sent a chill down my spine, a visceral understanding of the kind of ruthless adversary I was truly facing, a man who would burn down my whole world to save his own reputation. The sound of her shallow, rapid breathing was the only thing I could hear, and I noticed a slight, almost imperceptible tremor in her hand as she reached out to touch my arm, a genuine fear for my well-being that momentarily superseded all our past resentments. The moral stakes had escalated again. My fight for Maya's future was now an immediate fight for my survival, a life-or-death battle against a man who truly had nothing to lose but his pride, a man who saw my life as disposable collateral damage.
Mas eu não sabia que a complicação de Sarah era, na verdade, uma pista.
The most devastating revelation, the true secret hidden behind Richard's flawless facade, came not from a business journal, but from an almost throwaway comment Sarah made while she was frantically pacing my office floor, a scent of desperation and high-end perfume filling the air. She was recounting Richard's near-manic fear of public scandal, and she stopped suddenly, her voice dropping to a near whisper, her eyes fixed on a dusty blueprint tacked to the wall, saying, He said he needs to clear his accounts, Frank, completely. Said it has to look like he has no assets if he's going to save himself from that environmental disaster. The lawsuit, it's not just a fine, it's a criminal liability, an absolute disaster if it goes public. The phrase clear his accounts was the key. Richard wasn't just worried about an audit, he was setting up a preemptive corporate shell game, planning to officially divest himself of all major assets, including the supposed commitment to Maya's tuition, to protect his personal fortune from the looming, massive criminal environmental lawsuit, a scandal that would not just tarnish his reputation but send him to jail. This was the dark, hidden truth. His entire offer to Maya wasn't an act of generosity, but a cynical, legally structured act of divestiture, a disposable line item he intended to quickly terminate under the penalty clause to get that large, clean, final payout to Maya, money that would then be legally considered a pre-existing financial obligation to a family member, shielding it from the coming storm of asset freezes and litigation. The air in the office suddenly felt impossibly cold, the scattered blueprints on my desk seeming to spin with the shock of the revelation. I finally understood the scratch marks, the rush, the legal maneuvering. Richard planned to publicly pay for her college, then immediately back out, claiming a sudden, necessary corporate reorganization, allowing him to use the contractual penalty fee as a tax-deductible, asset-protected legal transfer of a massive amount of cash to Maya, all while publicly maintaining the image of the benevolent, but now financially constrained, stepfather. The contract was never about controlling Maya. It was a complex, elegant mechanism for Richard's criminal escape, and Maya, my daughter, was simply a legally convenient, wealthy pawn in his scheme.
Naquele momento, eu percebi que meu fracasso financeiro era a única coisa que me permitia enxergar o quão podre Richard realmente era.
The betrayal wasn't Richard's. It was Sarah's, a devastating moment of sacrifice for her own survival that cut me to the core. A deep, wounding revelation that she had known all along about Richard's scheme, about the incoming lawsuit, about the cynical use of Maya's future as a legal shield, and she had remained silent, choosing her own comfort, her own affluent life, over exposing the truth to her daughter and protecting me from the imminent business-destroying audit. I looked at her, standing there, the scent of her expensive clothes and her desperation mixing into a potent, bitter cocktail of betrayal, and the knowledge that she had been a willing, silent participant in Richard's manipulation, a betrayal of motherhood and our shared history, hit me with a sickening force. However, in that same moment of devastating realization, I saw the true, desperate need for her self-preservation in her eyes, a woman trapped in a gilded cage who had made a terrible, morally compromising choice, and I understood that exposing her would destroy her life and, by extension, cause irreparable emotional damage to Maya, a consequence I couldn't bear to inflict. I made a critical, painful sacrifice. I chose to protect Sarah from the public fallout, a decision that meant I would have to face Richard's coming economic warfare alone, without the powerful leverage of exposing his entire scheme and her complicity. I know, Sarah, I said, my voice low and heavy, the scent of wet dust and resignation filling the space between us. I know what he's doing, and I know you knew. The blood drained from her face, and her silence was the only confirmation I needed, a heavy, suffocating admission of guilt. I handed her a piece of scratch paper with the details of the zoning inspection and the location of the impending stop work order, saying, "Tell Richard to cancel the inspection. If he doesn't, I sign the contract. But the moment I sign, the moment he gets his asset shield, I release everything I know about the environmental lawsuit to the local news. The full criminal liability, the whole truth." I had sacrificed my moral high ground with Sarah to gain the necessary leverage against Richard. A dark, necessary move.
Nada poderia ter me preparado para a queda iminente que minha decisão provocaria, a sensação de que tudo estava prestes a desmoronar.
The world utterly collapsed the next morning, not with a bang, but with the terrifying, silent sight of a bright yellow city zoning department stop work order notice taped aggressively onto the main entrance of my construction site. A clear, brutal sign that Richard had ignored my warning and chosen all-out economic war over giving up his manipulative control, a move that meant he believed he was untouchable and that he could destroy me without consequence. I drove to the site, the morning air crisp and cold, the scent of damp concrete and freshly cut lumber now hanging over a dead zone of paralyzed work, and the sight of my crew. Men I had worked with for 20 years, men who depended on me for their livelihoods. Standing around, confused and defeated, was the lowest point I had ever experienced, a profound, crushing failure that had nothing to do with me, but everything to do with Richard's callous, vicious need for control. The stop work order was based on a ridiculously minor, obscure violation of an antiquated foundation code, a bureaucratic weapon used with surgical precision to inflict maximum damage, and the smell of diesel from the idle trucks only added to the atmosphere of total, paralyzed despair. I felt a wave of crushing responsibility wash over me, a physical ache in my chest as I looked at my foreman, Marco, his face a grim mask of worry, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. What now? Richard had not only ruined my business, but he had publicly, demonstrably proven to Maya that I was too weak, too poor, too inconsequential to stand up to the wealthy elite, a strategic victory that cut deeper than any financial loss. I walked away from the site, the humiliating sight of the yellow notice burning in my mind, the sound of the idling machinery a sad, expensive silence, realizing that Richard had truly beaten me on every front. He had secured his corporate shield, he had successfully neutralized my leverage, and he had publicly stripped me of my dignity in front of my employees and, indirectly, my daughter. I had reached absolute zero, a state of total public defeat, where the only thing left was to sign the contract and watch my life fall apart. A complete and total surrender.
Mas eu não sabia que o colapso me daria a clareza final que eu precisava.
The moment of clarity didn't arrive in a dramatic flash of insight, but in the quiet, empty silence of my office after I had spent an hour staring at the damning stop work order notice, the feeling of defeat finally giving way to a cold, razor-sharp resolve, a profound understanding of what I had to do. I needed to stop fighting Richard's battle and start fighting my own, which wasn't about the contract, the money, or the public perception, but about a single, simple truth. I had to expose Richard's villainy to the only person who mattered, my daughter, Maya, and give her the chance to choose her own father. The truth in this cynical, financially driven conflict was the only weapon Richard couldn't buy, censor, or leverage, and the path forward was suddenly clear. I had to intentionally and publicly trigger the massive environmental scandal, the criminal lawsuit, the one thing Richard feared above all else, even if it meant sacrificing my business, even if it meant signing the contract first to secure the penalty payout for Maya, a desperate and necessary act of parental sacrifice that prioritized her financial stability and moral clarity over my own comfort and company's survival. I picked up the original contract one last time, the thin paper feeling like a heavy, cold stone in my hand, and saw the faint scratch marks again, the ghosts of Richard's erased signature, realizing that my goal was no longer to prevent him from using the termination clause, but to force him to use it under the worst possible circumstances, making his act of self-preservation a public, humiliating exposé of his true character. The realization gave me a fierce, protective energy, replacing the earlier despair with a burning, paternal resolve that tasted like iron and cold determination. And I knew that this final, desperate move would be the culmination of every failed attempt, every humiliation, and every sacrifice, a final confrontation that would redefine what it meant to be her father. Naquili momento eu percebi que a honra valia mais do que qualquer negocio. The preparation for the final confrontation was a quiet, meticulous operation conducted entirely through my small, trustworthy network, a plan that relied on timing, precision, and the power of narrative, a strategy designed to turn Richard's greatest fear, public scandal, into the ultimate weapon against him. First, I called Vinny and Marco not to fight the stop work order, but to prepare the final, devastating move. Vinny drafted a clean, concise press release detailing Richard Sterling's imminent criminal liability in the overseas environmental disaster, complete with legal references and documented, suppressed evidence, a document ready to be electronically released the second I gave the signal. Marco, ever the silent ally, made a crucial call to a distant, retired associate who owed him a favor, a veteran journalist at the only major local outlet that Richard hadn't managed to financially co-opt, securing a promise of immediate publication, a guaranteed audience for the truth. Then came the painful part. I called Richard's office and, in a voice devoid of emotion, I agreed to sign the contract, scheduling the final, official ceremony for that very afternoon. The same day the stop work order was paralyzing my business, a clear sign to Richard that he had won. The contrast was the setup. I needed him at his most smug, his most triumphant, completely certain of his victory. A performance I had to sell to him without revealing the cold, calculating determination hardening my heart. I dressed in my best suit, the wool feeling rough and unfamiliar against my skin. The scent of fresh laundry a stark contrast to the construction dust that usually permeated my clothes. A conscious choice to meet him on his own turf, ready to sign the document that would officially transfer my parental financial rights. I was walking into the lion's den, but this time, I was holding the match, and the smell of ozone in the air felt like the charged calm before a massive electrical storm. Nothing could have prepared me for the sheer arrogance Richard displayed at the signing. The confrontation exploded the moment I walked into Richard's pristine, sterile office for the final signing. He was waiting for me, standing confidently by the enormous window, a perfect silhouette of success against the backdrop of the city. The afternoon sun glaring aggressively, emphasizing the deep satisfaction on his face, the ultimate moment of his triumph. He didn't even acknowledge the stop work order, simply sliding the pen and the contract across the massive mahogany desk, his eyes alight with cruel, unadulterated pleasure, a victorious look that made my blood boil. "Frank," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, the sound of his Italian leather shoes clicking softly on the marble floor as he walked around the desk, a silent, public strut of victory. "You made the responsible choice, finally. Took a little persuasion, but you got there. Maya's future is now secure, thanks to me. Sign." I picked up the pen, the silver cool and heavy in my hand, and deliberately signed my name. A slow, decisive stroke that was a public act of surrender. A move that secured Maya's $300,000 penalty payout protection, and as I finished, Richard snatched the contract back, his eyes greedily scanning my signature, his self-satisfaction almost palpable, the scent of his expensive cologne filling the air as he leaned over the desk. Then, with absolute cold finality, I pushed a small, discreet envelope across the desk toward him. A simple white envelope containing Vinny's carefully documented press release about the criminal environmental lawsuit, the one he thought he had completely suppressed. "Congratulations, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through his smug silence. "The contract is signed, and my press release about your criminal liability and asset hiding, which now includes the cynical use of your stepdaughter as a legal shield, just went live on every local news outlet. You won the battle for the business, but you just lost the war for your reputation, your freedom, and Maya's respect." The effect was devastating. Richard's face immediately drained of all color, the contract fluttering from his suddenly slack grip, falling silently onto the mahogany floor, the only sound the faint thud of the paper hitting the polished wood. The realization that I had let him win the signature battle only to destroy his entire life in the next second hit him with the force of a physical blow. A moment of climactic emotional justice that shattered his carefully crafted world. Nothing could have prepared me for the silence that followed, the expression of pure terror in his eyes. The final, unexpected twist arrived the moment Richard, pale and shaking, lunged for the phone on his desk, his panic-stricken fingers fumbling with the receiver as he tried desperately to call his PR team, only to be interrupted by the sudden, sharp buzz of a notification on his personal computer screen, a sound that made his already strained composure shatter completely. The notification was a massive, bright red urgent bulletin from his own company's legal department, clearly visible in the corner of his monitor. A preemptive internal memo confirming that, due to the devastating criminal implications of the quickly breaking environmental story, the board had immediately invoked an emergency corporate restructuring and liquidation clause, effectively freezing his assets and forcing his immediate total resignation from the CEO position, a financial and professional death blow delivered not by my press release, but by his own paranoid corporate structure turning on him the moment the first sign of external scandal appeared. The delicious, ultimate irony was that Richard had set up his company with such ironclad, ruthless protocols to protect it from outside threats that the moment I publicly triggered the threat, his own system, acting completely independently, moved faster and more decisively than I ever could have, triggering a complete and total corporate coup d'état against him. Richard was not just beaten. He was annihilated by his own creation, a man whose obsessive need for control was the very thing that destroyed him, a massive, satisfying reversal of expectations that made my small press release look like an opening salvo compared to the full-scale war his own company was waging on him. I watched as he slumped into his leather chair, a defeated man, the scent of his despair now overpowering his expensive cologne, the silence in the room heavy with the realization that the justice I sought wasn't delivered by me, but by the relentless, cold logic of his own corporate world. The final twist was that the most powerful force in the room wasn't my meager power, but the self-protective, impersonal ruthlessness of the world he had built. What happened next changed everything for Maya, and not just because of the money. The consequences of the confrontation and Richard's swift, public downfall were immediate and surprisingly clean, providing the necessary resolution and justice that this story demanded. Richard, stripped of his power, his reputation, and facing the full force of a massive criminal environmental lawsuit, quickly became a pariah, and the public shaming was so complete that he vanished from the city within days, his meticulously crafted life dissolving into scandal and litigation, his punishment proportional to his ruthless ambition and the callousness of his actions. Crucially, the signed contract was still legally binding, and since Richard's termination, both corporate and personal, was now involuntary and public, the $300,000 penalty clause was automatically and legally triggered, providing Maya with the full, debt-free college tuition and living expenses, secured by the very corporate shield Richard had cynically tried to use for his own protection, a poetic justice that ensured the victim of his scheme was the ultimate beneficiary. The most important resolution, however, was the emotional one. Maya, after reading the full, devastating truth of Richard's plot in the news, the suppressed environmental evidence, the use of her education as a criminal asset shield, and the truth of the stop work order on my business, came straight to my small, dusty office, her face tear-streaked, not with anger, but with a profound, ashamed clarity. She didn't need me to explain. She just hugged me tightly, the scent of her hair familiar and comforting, whispering, "I'm so sorry, Dad. I didn't see it. I only saw the money." That moment, that complete, unconditional restoration of her faith and respect, was the true payoff, the emotional victory that made every humiliation and every sacrifice absolutely worth it. My construction business suffered, but Marco and the crew, knowing the truth of Richard's sabotage, rallied around me, a new, tighter bond forged in the common enemy, working extra hours to clear the minor violation and get the stop work order lifted, a small, tangible sign of community redemption. Nothing could have prepared me for what Maya asked me the next day. The new normal settled in with a quiet, satisfying rhythm. Maya, secure in her fully funded future and her moral clarity, left for college, but not before a small, profound moment that defined our restored relationship. Instead of taking one of Richard's expensive cars to the airport, she asked me to take her in my old, beat-up pickup truck, the one with the cracked windshield and the faint, comforting smell of diesel and dust. A conscious choice that symbolically rejected Richard's world and
Embraced mine.
As we drove, the morning sunlight glinting off the hood, she looked at me, a genuine, mature look of love and respect in her eyes, and said, "Dad, when I graduate, the first thing I'm doing is funding a scholarship for kids whose parents work honest, hard jobs. It's going to be named after your construction company, for the people who really build things." Her intention to pay it forward, to use the money secured by Richard's corruption for genuine good, was the final, satisfying echo of our underdog journey. I never imagined that standing up to a rich stepdad who mocked my poverty would lead to me almost losing my business, but it led to something far more valuable. A daughter who understood the difference between wealth and worth, and a relationship forged not in luxury, but in the crucible of truth and sacrifice. The moral of the story isn't about the money, but about the fact that the things that truly matter, dignity, integrity, and the love of your children, are the only assets that can never be seized, leveraged, or sold. The rich stepdad lost everything because he valued perception over people. I lost almost everything, but I gained the only thing that truly mattered: my daughter's unwavering respect. Now, the final question is, what's the one thing in your life that you're too afraid to risk losing, even if it means sacrificing your integrity? And that's the real tragedy. Richard sacrificed everything important for his pride, while I risked my comfort for my integrity. My story shows that sometimes the biggest battles are fought not with money, but with truth. If you believe, like Maya, that integrity is worth more than wealth, hit that subscribe button right now. Every subscriber helps us prove that real justice can be served, even against the rich and powerful. And while you're at it, click here, Apantarpara Attila, to watch my last video where I reveal the surprising thing Richard's lawyer told me after the scandal broke. Trust me, the fallout was even messier than this. Subscribe and stay tuned, because the next chapter in fighting the system is always around the corner.